Yeah. Oh, look who's here.
Isn't it?
Hey. Yep, he's over there.
Oh, I love
Yeah, those four are for you.
Very positive.
I'm gonna go. Yeah, sit on. I asked him.
5 more chairs coming.
Okay, go ahead. So what I'd like you to do, so you do all your shit just before you introduce. Okay. And then it's just, yes, okay. All right.
Wow. I can't say I've ever spoken. One will be for Harriet.
Yeah. Or
Don't give away your seat. Right up front here.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see so many faces here tonight. We're all very excited for the launch of Cecil Rosner's book, Manipulating the Message. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Bookseller itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Manipulating the Message, How Powerful Forces Shape the News by Cecil Rosner. We'd like to thank, yes. We'd like to thank Dundurn Press for both publishing this book and for all their assistance in making tonight happen. Just a few quick procedural details before we get started. The author will be introduced and then we'll speak on the book. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you do have questions, please raise your hand. I will approach you with microphone. That's to help the people at home watching our live stream to hear properly. And then there will be a signing after the event. So in that case, we will ask you, while we transport Mr. Rosner over to the signing desk over by the cash tables, that he gets properly set up, and then when you're all ready, we can go get our book signed. I've just been made aware that our premier is here, Mr. Canoe, and I believe he's going to come up and say a few words.
Hey everybody, it's so great to see such an awesome turnout for a literary event here in the city, and I want to congratulate Cecil on this amazing launch. Congrats, especially because this is like 3 times as many people who were at my last book launch. And in addition to that, you've got like the who's who of CBC Manitoba over the years, you know. I think I saw Terry McLeod here somewhere. And, oh yeah, here we go, right there. And we've got Bruce Oak and all sorts of reporters and producers and journalists over the years. So it's a testament to the career that Cecil built in the public service of delivering quality journalism here in Manitoba. And the reason why it's important for me to come out is I work with his son. His son is actually my chief of staff. And so we have many connections. Working with Mark, I could say that Cecil and Harriet have done an amazing job in cultivating a family that are kind-hearted, good-natured, and moral people of the highest caliber. And that's why I'm so excited to hear about the book and to get a chance to read it, because I know that working with Cecil for a few years, one of the things that I always took out of it, and I'm sure that Carolyn and everyone who's here having worked with Cecil over the years would testify to the same thing, is that Cecil always put the ethics of journalism first and foremost each and every day on the job. And in the current media landscape and the cynicism that seems to permeate so much of our culture today, to have somebody who defines their career with an eye towards the public good and upholding the highest standards of integrity in the use of journalism as a lever to hold the powerful to account, other than newly elected NDP governments. It's certainly something that I think we can all get behind. So I'm so thrilled to be here and really want to congratulate you, Cecil. All the best.
That was cool. Cool cameo. Okay, well, now we're going to introduce Carolyn Bargout. She is a CBC Manitoba investigative reporter, and she has a few words to share about Cecil.
Thank you. Holding power to account, that is what I think of when I think of Cecil Rosner. He's been a journalist for more than 4 decades. Most of you know him personally. He's written 3 books, including one that helped free a man that was wrongfully accused and spent 23 years in prison. Of course, we're talking about David Milgaard. Cecil has worked for the Winnipeg Free Press. He spent 31 years at CBC Manitoba. That is where I knew Cecil. He was my boss, of course, and he led the investigative team. He's very supportive of investigative journalism. He was an advocate for investigative journalism, still is an advocate for that. He teaches an investigative journalism course at University of Winnipeg. He's also one of the smartest, kindest human beings that I know. He questions things, he listens respectfully, even if you have differing opinions. When he retired, it was during the pandemic, and so we couldn't have an in-person goodbye. So we had to do it over Zoom. I cannot tell you how many people were on this Zoom call. There were hundreds of people who willingly joined this Zoom call. And they were waiting in line, a lot of people waiting in line just to tell him what he means to them professionally, but also personally, because he's just that kind of a guy. As a boss, he was always very supportive, but he'd also call you on your bullshit, which I think is super important for journalists. He really held us to account also. Cecil never shied away from tough conversations or asking tough questions. If you know him, you know he's a whiz at chess. He's also won countless journalism awards, including a Commissioner and a Gemini Award. Now, you'd also think that Cecil is good at everything, but apparently he's not a very good cook. His son says that his recipe for Spanish rice was not great growing up, but that he makes bagels now and they are very good. Now, did you know that he's also good at magic tricks? Yeah, me neither. But what he is best known for is journalism, honesty, and integrity. His latest book is called Manipulating the Message: How Powerful Forces Shape the News. Now, Cecil's mantra was always, how do you know that? As a journalist, when you pitch a story or when you tell him some of the research that you've done, he would always say, well, how do you know that? That's part of his investigative methodology that helps guide his journalists towards the truth, despite powerful interests who might be steering us in another direction. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce my mentor and one of the greatest human beings, Mr. Cecil Rosner.
Yikes. What do I do now? I'm going to talk for a bit, and then at the end of that, maybe for about like 15, 20 minutes, and then I have a super short reading that I want to do from the book, and then we'll open it up for questions. That's okay. So I wanted to say that it's very fashionable these days to hear people talking about misinformation and disinformation. I'm sure you've heard a lot of that kind of talk. If you listen to some experts, you might even think it's some kind of new development. Some people blame the internet, some people blame Donald Trump or social media or foreign bots or conspiracy theorists sitting in their basements pumping out fake news stories. But here's what I think. I think the process of misinforming and misleading and deceiving and manipulating and outright lying has been going on for a very long time at the highest levels of society. And is it worse today? Probably, but the point I want to make is it's always been with us. And it's the media, and I'm not just talking about social media, I'm talking about news media as well, that's often the targeted transmission belt for the distorted messages. So that is what my book is about. It's a look under the hood to observe how this process happens. Now, I've worked in large newsrooms most of my life. For those of you who aren't familiar with newsrooms, let me explain how things go. You arrive every day to work to a pile of news releases with information different people want you to cover. There are press conferences scheduled throughout the day by organizations seeking your attention. The government and various politicians have a series of announcements they'll be making. Studies are being released. Think tank reports are being published. Polls are coming out. The police are making statements. Companies are announcing breakthroughs in science. New drugs are being touted as miracle cures. Tweets are being tweeted on the platform formerly known as Twitter. All this is happening, by the way, before you've even had your first cup of coffee in the morning. Okay, so you might say, fine, and it's the job of the journalist to decide what to cover and what not to cover, and to decide what's important and what isn't, to figure out what's the truth and what's just spin. And you'd be right. But here's the dirty little secret I have discovered in my career over the years. The vast majority of daily, conventional, mainstream journalism, not all, I've got to be mindful here, there are a lot of my good journalist friends are in this room, not all, but the vast majority is on the surface, reactive reporting that often doesn't get to the bottom of what is really going on. It's done quickly. It often takes what politicians and companies and military officials and other sources say at face value. And it doesn't subject statements to sufficient verification or critical thinking. And when you're trying to turn around a story in a matter of hours or a matter of minutes, in some cases, on multiple platforms, it's very difficult to verify the truth of assertions and claims. Instead, many journalists satisfy themselves with a more limited objective, which is the journalistic convention of getting both sides of the story, or multiple sides. And they gather what he said about a story and what she said about a story and what they said about a story. But here's a question. Is it fair that the sides with the most money, the most influence, and the most power are able to shout their messages the loudest? Does that help to get the truth out? Or does it lead to some people being duped? And just so I'm clear, because a lot of my good journalistic friends are in the audience, I want to stress right at the beginning that pretty much every reporter I've known over the years is an honest, hardworking, ethical person. They don't get up every morning with the intention of creating some fake news reports. They don't aspire to be the megaphones for other people's messages. But there are often forces at work that overwhelm even the best of intentions. Forces that seek to manipulate the news for their own ends, and often succeed in doing so. And I've provided dozens of real-life examples of this in the book, including times when I myself was among the people being duped. Now, by the way, my book is not all doom and gloom. I do, there are ways to combat this trend. I devoted a whole chapter to that. One of the most important is to invest far more heavily in investigative journalism, which I've been an advocate for my whole career, because that's the form of journalism that isn't just satisfied with people's claims and assertions, but it seeks to get to the truth of things. But I'll have more to say about that in a second. But I want to share this with you. Here's a statistic that I came across that I find very pertinent to this conversation. In 1991 in Canada, there were 13,000 reporters, okay? In our big country, 13,000 people who were identified on that census form as being a reporter. In the same year, there were about 24,000 people who worked in the public relations and communications field. So you had about 2 PR communications people per every reporter. That was in 1991. 30 years later, in 2021, the number of reporters has declined to about 11,000. And the number of public relations and communications people has increased to 160,000. Okay, and that's the situation we face right now. So that means the ratio is now about 14-1. Now, some of my friends are in the public relations and communications field. I will have more to say about that whole sector in a second. But just think about this. There is an army of people out there trying to cajole journalists into telling stories their clients want told, with the context and details their clients want highlighted, and with the absence of inconvenient facts their clients would just as soon see omitted. Journalists in this room of my vintage remember the day when you could just pick up the phone and call a cabinet minister. Maybe that'll happen again now. I'm not sure. Will it, Mark? I don't know. What? Or a government department head or company owner and ask them a question. Today, PR and communications departments generally shield these people from the media, rarely granting in-person interviews and demanding that questions be emailed so that responses can be carefully massaged. All the reporters here know what I'm talking about. We've seen this play out over the last few years. It makes it very difficult for journalists to get real accountability. Even when a decision maker does agree to do an interview, they've been carefully coached and trained in the ways of avoiding questions they don't want to answer. Those same public relations agencies train them on how to deflect questions and pivots to prearranged talking points and message tracks. It's how the game is played. Now, most of you know the difficult state journalism is in these days. There's a lot of newspapers have closed, there's been layoffs. There was a layoff today. Quebecor laid off 547 people. 1/3 of their entire workforce was laid off today. This is what's going on in the world of journalism in Canada these days. And traditional sources of revenue that used to fund newspapers and broadcast outlets have all declined. They've been drained off to the likes of Facebook and Google. And at the same time, there are more and more platforms to feed and more punishing 24-hour news cycles. It means reporters are being stretched to the limit. Like a typical reporter might have to take their own photos or edit their own material for radio and TV, file versions for 1 or 2 or more different platforms every day, which to me leaves very little time for actually verifying facts. And this is a bit of a problem. And I think it's meaning that journalists are relying more and more on the materials publicists, communications professionals, PR people are feeding them. And it means they're taking more and more things at face value. Now, one of the people I interviewed for my book is Alan Thompson. He's a former Toronto Star reporter. And he's currently head of the journalism department at Carleton University. This is what he told me, very interesting story. He ran for parliament once, or twice, I think. He didn't win, he was an unsuccessful candidate in Southern Ontario. But he said when no journalist showed up at some of his campaign announcements, he would write up a news story himself and send it to newspapers and media outlets, okay? And he said he told me he was astonished to find media outlets filing reports on his meetings with the only source being his press release, which they sometimes printed verbatim. And I loved what he told me, quote, "No one should ever run a press release issued by a political candidate. Remember, he was the candidate." And now he teaches his students to beware of the press release. Nor is this some kind of anomaly. I've spoken to people in the world of PR, I have friends in the world of PR, who tell me that media routinely reproduce great chunks of their press releases verbatim, often without checking whether the statements being made are accurate. And I give many examples of this in the book. In fact, when the PR industry succeeds in getting a journalist to amplify their message, they actually have a term for it. It's called earned media, coverage they didn't have to pay for. I want to mention this because I think it's pertinent. A recent example of taking things at face value and simply repeating those things in an uncritical way was the standing ovation given to that member of the Waffen SS Nazi unit member in Parliament. I think you all remember that story. Reporters who mentioned this on the day it happened simply repeated what they had been told, that the man fought against the Russians in World War II and was therefore being honored as a hero. That was the narrative. That's what got reported on that day. And it was only the next day when bloggers and some alternative media outlets started pointing out the obvious, that if you're fighting the Soviets in World War II, it means you were fighting with the Nazis. And once this was exposed, a new narrative was presented, that this was some sort of one-off mistake by the speaker who resigned, and no one else in government knew what was going on. Personally, I don't buy that narrative either. And the reason is that there's been a movement to whitewash the history of this particular unit for years, with monuments and awards and university endowments, all in an effort to reshape the message of what it actually did during the war. Now, in researching the book, I did delve into the history of public relations, which I'd never done before. This is a discipline that's taught in colleges and universities these days. But you might be surprised by what some of the foundational thinkers in the field had to say. For example, a lot of people point to a fellow by the name of Edward Bernays as one of the founders of public relations. Have you heard of him in the United States? He wrote a book in 1928. The title of the book is Propaganda. And here's a bit of what he had to say. And now I'm directly quoting Edward Bernays. Quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society." Here's my favorite line. "Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. End of the quote. That's one of the founders of public relations in the United States. Bernays went on to do PR work for General Electric, Procter & Gamble, American Tobacco, Dodge Motors, several US presidents. One of his techniques was to create front groups, which sounded like consumer advocate groups or neutral institutes, but were really controlled by the industries that they purported to monitor. For instance, he represented the United Fruit Company in Guatemala in the 40s and 50s. Okay, he was the PR agent representing that company. And the company at that time was resisting efforts on the part of the government of Guatemala to nationalize it. So he set up something called the Middle American Information Bureau that sent out press releases under the guise of an independent sounding institute. He did the same thing when he was working for Mack Trucks, when he invented the Trucking Information Service and the Trucking Service Bureau. This tactic was used extensively by Big Tobacco, which had a number of groups with names like the Center for Indoor Air Research and the Council for Tobacco Research. And the California Drivers Alliance, that sounds legitimate enough, right? It's a creature of the Western States Petroleum Association. And there's a lot of other industries that do the same thing. And this technique continues to be used to this day. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of companies and other sources exploit this journalistic convention of trying to get both sides of the story by insisting on having their say in scientific debates, even when the science has been clearly resolved. So what do I mean? Like for decades, media outlets quoted these phony tobacco institutes as so-called balance in their stories about whether tobacco caused cancer. And the same is true when it comes to stories about climate change, when for years journalists sought out the supposed other side of the story by looking for the tiny minority of researchers who deny the effects of fossil fuels on the environment. Now, thankfully, I can say that more and more media outlets are coming to the realization that they have to reject this notion of false balance in news reporting. But it went on for many, many, many years. Here's one last quote from Edward Bernays, because I like the guy so much, in which he actually admits that his techniques can amount to manipulation of news. He says, "The instruments by which public opinion is organized and focused may be misused, but such organization and focusing are necessary to orderly life." So my book looks into different aspects of this manipulation, whether it's practiced by companies or politicians, think tanks, police, the military, intelligence agencies, governments at war, purveyors of junk science and sketchy polls, influencers of all kinds. Buying influence used to be considered a seedy practice, but today there's an entire multi-billion-dollar industry called influencer marketing. This is really interesting. This involves recruiting and paying people who have built up a social media following and getting them to plug your product or policy. So if you're Cristiano Ronaldo, for instance, you can charge up to $2 million for one single social media post. But you don't have to be Kendall Jenner or Kardashian to actually get into this game, because even if you have a moderate number of followers, you can earn the status of being a micro-influencer, okay? And for instance, in the 2020 presidential election in the US, Mike Bloomberg offered $150 to individual micro-influencers who would post about how great a candidate he was. And when the war in Ukraine broke out, the White House invited 30 top TikTok influencers to a special briefing on the US position on the war, which they all then parroted back to their followers. And the problem, there are many problems, I think, with this, but the problem with a lot of this is a lot of this influence peddling isn't disclosed. Sometimes it is, often it isn't. So when you're reading your social media, and even worse in a way, when reporters, because a lot of reporters take their guidance from, I've been in morning meetings when people said, this is getting a lot of buzz online. Really? Well, who's planting it? Who's buying it? I think is a question that has to be asked. It's sort of manipulation at its sneakiest, I think. Now, on the subject of buying influence, there is something else I want to mention, and this is a phenomenon in which media outlets are actually directly complicit in the manipulation. So apologies to any media managers out there. I used to be one myself. Here I'm referring to advertising content that masquerades as news. For a long time, newspapers have been running, advertorials, which are ads that are presented in the form of a news story. And, this is often, but not always, accompanied by some tiny little disclaimer somewhere saying, well, that this been bought and paid for. But if you think about entire sections of your newspaper, like the autos or travel or homes, it's often difficult, for me anyway, to distinguish, an ad from a piece of news. Travel pieces are sometimes written by writers whose expenses have been paid by the airlines and hotels they write about. Some news outlets clearly disclose this conflict, others don't. And the latest terminology for this phenomenon is sponsored content. And media outlets sell it to advertisers as an attractive way to leverage their credibility of their newspaper or news operation. An outright ad is an obvious way to sell your product or service, but if you dress it up in the style of a news story, some people are going to be led to believe that it has more credibility. So I would say when journalists are thinking about, gee, why is the credibility of our profession going down a little bit? That may, in my mind, be part of it. And to their credit, a lot of individual journalists have been critical of their employers for doing this kind of thing. Now, beyond all the overt methods of influencing the media and in turn the public, my book also looks into some journalistic conventions and practices that give priority to so-called reliable sources and conventional wisdoms. In my I have a chapter about the police in this book, and I talk about, for instance, how they have historically discounted and minimized crimes involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, always feeding media information that had the effect of blaming the victims themselves, suggesting they were somehow to blame for their own fate. They were involved in the sex trade, or they were leading a risky lifestyle. This was the terminology the police would always use in these stories. And really it was used to justify delaying or ignoring some of these investigations altogether. And these same supposedly reliable police sources also routinely whitewash misconduct of their fellow officers. We had the case here in Winnipeg last month of a 37-year-old Indigenous man who died as he was being arrested by Winnipeg police. It was a wellness check. He was wandering in and out of traffic. I think you may have seen this news story. And the chief of police actually lambasted the CBC for interviewing eyewitnesses to this event and trying to investigate what happened independently. And the chief insisted it's the police themselves who should control the narrative in such situations. If you don't believe me, go check his own Substack account. That is what he said. My book cites case after case where this police narrative has turned out to be a lie, from Rodney King and George Floyd to Breonna Taylor in the US and J.J. Harper in Manitoba, and many more. I always think back, when I'm thinking about these types of things, about who should the reliable sources be that the media should listen to, I always think back to the story of Mayor Arar, who was the Canadian engineer who was secretly transported to Syria, where he was imprisoned and tortured on suspicion of terrorism. This is about almost 20 years ago. Not only was he innocent, but a commission of inquiry eventually found that unnamed Canadian government officials had engaged in a smear campaign by feeding journalists false information to paint Arar as a terrorist. And this is all documented in an official commission of inquiry. And many journalists, unfortunately, at the time, prioritized the claims of the supposedly reliable government sources over Arar's own insistence of his innocence. And I should also mention that in times of war and crisis, where reliance on supposedly reliable sources and conventional narratives can this is when it can really lead you badly astray. So whether it's the war in Ukraine or the war in the Middle East or others, it's important, I think, for journalists to think independently and investigate thoroughly before blindly repeating what some sources wish them to think and report. Now, my final chapter does suggest a number of things I think would improve the situation, including a consistent attempt to challenge these conventional narratives that have been drummed into journalists and the public by decades of repetition and persuasion. I make the case for less reliance on press releases and daily reactive reporting and greater emphasis on investigative work that tries to find out the truth of what's really going on, especially when it uses modern scientific tools of inquiry, of which we now have lots that have been added in the last few years to help journalists do their work. And I also call for journalism to thoroughly reject colonial stereotypes and racist and sexist prejudices, which have led to misleading and harmful coverage of many communities. I also encourage people to support the many exciting startup ventures in journalism that are doing good work, even as some of the conventional mainstream outlets are in decline. There's lots more I suggest could be done to improve the situation, but if I keep going, I'm afraid you're not going to buy my book. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. So before we go to questions, I want to read you a little chunk from my book. I mean, the indulgent thing for me in writing this was that there's a little bit of memoir in there because I drew on a bunch of stories that have happened to me to illustrate some of the points I was trying to do. And because I've been around for a long time, some of these stories date from like the 70s to like last year. So I'm going to read you one little anecdote. This is out of chapter 4. It's titled Political Lies. Is Wad still here, by the way? Apologies. Okay, so here we go. Deception in the political arena is so commonplace that when journalists stand toe-to-toe with politicians, they often experience an overwhelming feeling they're being fed a lie. Much rarer is the time when the journalist has immediate access to proof. That happened several times in my career, perhaps most spectacularly in November 1984, when I interviewed Federal Finance Minister Michael Wilson. Just 2 months after the progressive conservative government led by Brian Mulroney was elected, Wilson visited Manitoba as part of a tour of the West to meet with his provincial counterparts. Ottawa had just unveiled plans to slash government spending in every direction, consistent with the deficit-fighting ethos sweeping many Western countries at the time. And austerity was the new buzzword, and no part of government spending would go unexamined. That included fundamental aspects of Canada's social safety net, including child benefits, old age security programs, and unemployment insurance. According to this plan, the province would have to do their part in the belt-tightening process, and Manitoba's share of anticipated cuts to its federal transfer payments was $72 million. Wilson had scheduled a meeting with Manitoba's finance minister, Vic Schrader, at the downtown West End Hotel in Winnipeg. The two politicians emerged from their 90-minute chat and sat in the hotel lobby for an impromptu news conference. Wilson placed a bundle of file folders on the coffee table in front of him and told the throng of reporters that he was there to listen and consider Manitoba's position. No decisions had yet been made, no judgments rendered, and Manitoba would not be treated differently or more severely than any other province, he said. After a few minutes, Wilson dashed off to attend a luncheon at the hotel where he was to deliver the keynote address. The assembled reporters scattered to file their reports. I lingered behind, and after reporters from all the other media outlets had left, I noticed the file folders were still exactly where Wilson had put them. 5 minutes passed, then 10. After 15 minutes, when no one had come to retrieve anything, I sat down at the coffee table and gingerly opened a file. Inside was a black book stamped secret. with instructions on how Wilson should handle his meeting in Manitoba. I had no intention of taking the folders with me or even so much as moving them, but I reasoned that if a politician was so imprudent as to leave them abandoned in a public place, I was justified in reading. It was a decision my bosses at the Winnipeg Free Press backed up. Phew. Despite furious blowback from Wilson and the Prime Minister himself. What I found inside revealed that Wilson had not been forthright at the news conference. Memos from his deputy minister confirmed Manitoba was the hardest hit province regarding the transfer payment cuts and said no compelling evidence had been presented to indicate Ottawa should back away from the plan. At the same time, Wilson was being secretly urged not to deliver too hard a message to Manitoba during these meetings, given the controversy the cuts had stirred. It all appeared to be a stage-managed exercise in public relations. The entire time I read through the file, dictating portions into my tape recorder, I expected someone to burst into the lobby, grab the material back. It never happened. After more than an hour, I approached one of Wilson's aides and told them about the wayward files, and they retrieved them. But after the election ended, I decided to test Wilson again on how truthful he would be. One of the memos addressed to Wilson said that if Manitoba succeeded in avoiding the funding cut, other provinces would make similar claims and the cost to Ottawa would be $1.3 billion. It was an exact calculation and was clearly spelled out in the brief to Wilson. Well before Wilson knew that I had read through the documents, I asked him explicitly what this cost would be. I used the identical language in the memo. He looked me straight in the eye. We don't know, he said. It's hard to say. The affair became known as the Hotel Papers Caper, triggering intense opposition questions in Parliament. For the federal Liberals and New Democrats, it was the perfect opportunity to bash the new government for its lack of transparency. Did he mislead the people of Manitoba, asked Liberal leader at the time, John Turner, in question period, on the same day my story was published? Will the Prime Minister instruct the Minister of Finance to consult from now on in a more honest and open way? Chimed in Manitoba MP Lloyd Axworthy. Mulrooney defended his minister, calling him a man of unimpeachable integrity. Always quick to try to take the offensive, Mulrooney went further and accused me of pilfering the documents. That led NDP leader Ed Broadbent to proclaim, "It is a curious world," this is a quote, "it is a curious world when a cabinet minister is so sloppy and careless to leave behind a document that the Prime Minister accuses someone else of pilfering. It is a strange government we have." The next day, Axworthy jumped to my defense over the pilfering accusation of the House of Commons. Quote, "Now that he has had the opportunity to check the record and recognizing that the press person in question was only living up to the standards for open communication by the government, which the Prime Minister has called for, is he prepared to apologize for that remark and begin to repair the breach of trust he has with members of the media?" To which Mulrooney replied, "Mr. Speaker, if I have offended anyone, including the honorable member, I apologize." It's the closest I ever got to an apology from the Prime Minister of Canada. Thank you.
Okay, we'll throw to questions from the audience.
Hey Cecil,
Hey, Zach.
increasingly now it's more than just words and facts, it's like imagery and video that we're being challenged on. What do you foresee as the newsroom technique or strategy to tackle things like that?
That's a really good question. I was playing around with a piece of AI software this week. It's called Hey Gen. So you can record a video of yourself saying something in English, and then you choose a drop-down menu and it'll convert it into any language you choose. And it shows me speaking fluent German, which I don't do. So what it means is fakery is only going to get worse and worse, right, on social media. But actually, I addressed this in the book. There's a couple things I'd say. We need journalism organizations need skilled individuals who are able to sift through that kind of material. And that's a matter of training and real due diligence. That's one thing. And the other thing I want to say is, I teach a course at the University of Winnipeg, and I developed a new course that I'm doing through the University of Manitoba. And I've got colleagues here from both institutions, which I'm grateful for. But the one at the University of Manitoba deals with media literacy and critical thinking for the general public, which I think is really important. I think all of us, everybody has to improve their critical thinking skills. When you're reading media, and you're watching TV or listening to radio or you're reading a website or whatever, you have to be reading it really critically. And when you're looking at an image, you have to ask basic questions. When was this taken? Was this taken in Gaza last week, or is this from 20 years ago? Because there are all kinds of people out there trying to dupe us, both in official and unofficial capacities. So I think, yeah, that's how, those are some of the things I think need to happen on that front.
Yeah, I have another one at the back here.
You mentioned both sides. It makes you sound like Joni Mitchell, and I know you wanted a musical career. But if things are the same as they were when I was in the newsroom, we were, as public journalists, necessarily, we had to present both sides. That was called balance. And it's predicated upon the notion that there's a thing called objectivity in journalism. So the question I really would love to hear you answer is about this notion of the objective and about the problem that CBC has in that presenting both sides means you always tilt what could be a much better story in a direction, in fact, makes nonsense of it.
Okay, thanks, Robert. I'm glad you asked that, because I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I'm against getting both sides of the story. I'm all in favor of it. It's mandatory that we do that. The point I was trying to make is that we can't leave it at that. That can't replace the actual objective of finding out what is the truth of the situation. So for instance, in my book, I talk about, you all remember when the war in Ukraine began, and there was, there incidents happen, like the incident happened in Bucha, if you remember that, or there was an incident in the Middle East war of a bombing of a hospital. And one side says this happened, and another side says that happened. It's not good enough just to do a news story saying this is what this side said and this is what that side said. My point is, you have to independently investigate these things. So yes, I want to hear what all sides say, but we can't be satisfied that that's the end of the story. We have to engage in independent investigation of what actually took place. And, in terms of objectivity and subjectivity, I want to say this. There's a lot of subjectivity in news gathering, but it comes in this respect. What you choose to cover is subjective. Completely subjective. I can be running a news organization, choose to cover these 20 stories one day, and you could be running another one and you choose to cover 20 different ones. But once we decide what we're covering, that's when objectivity, the objective method, as scientific an approach as we can muster, has to kick in. And we can't be swayed by what our religious or other kinds of beliefs might be about anything, and we have to be as objective as a scientist in a laboratory would be in conducting an experiment. That's what I think journalism has to do.
We've got a couple more coming from this area.
Hey, Cecil, congratulations. Can't wait to read the book. I wanted to ask you a question about your old newsroom that unfortunately we all mourn that you've left, but have you given any thought to the last mayoral election? Because I think a lot of people in this room might recall that the results were really, I think, significantly swayed by some investigative journalism that came out of your old newsroom. And I'm wondering about the whole idea of opposition research, because I think you journalists, you get a lot of opposition research from competitors during an election, and you choose, what to run with. But is that also not a form of sort of that same kind of publicity industry that you referred to earlier?
I know what you're referring to, but I don't know, do you have information that I don't about what the origins of that story are? Like, I have a little bit of information because I spoke to the reporter. I asked him, how did you get this story? And he told me it was his work that got it. And it was pretty, I don't want to say it was simple, it was a very good, I think it was a very good piece of journalism. It was very well researched. And he simply was curious. He looked at someone's resume and said, okay, how did this go? How good a job were they doing in their last couple of engagements, and went and asked people what they thought. And I think that is good journalism. But on your central point, I would say this: journalists need to take tips from anywhere they can get them. Sometimes tips come from the weirdest and wackiest places you might imagine, and sometimes they come from people with bad intentions. It doesn't matter in this sense. You have to verify the truth and authenticity of the information they're giving you. That is the key factor. And if there's a bad actor trying to spread a false story and you're doing your job properly as a journalist, you'll find it to be false and you won't run with it. So that's what I would say on that topic.
Okay, we have another one in the back here. You can step
Hi, Cecil.
Hi, buddy. How are you? My old Street Press colleague.
Yeah. This is great. This looks like a really great book. This has been my hobby for the last 36 years. I was in from the first days I stepped into a newsroom, I had the feeling there was something totally wrong with the business, like totally wrong. And the problem today is not so much the journalism, what journalists are doing. The problem is that news has become unwatchable, and it doesn't matter what the subject is. The war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East right now, it is unbearable, it is unwatchable. American news has become unwatchable since 2016. People I think, are very conscious of all of the tricks, and they're simply Netflixing the news. People don't even get the news on whatever it is. They certainly don't get it on TV. I've been a news junkie for a long time, and I am not watching the news. It's unbearable.
Yeah, that's sad.
So this is the story. The story with newspapers is that they've been losing circulation since the 1950s. I started in 1977, and the slide has been going on ever since with a brief pause. But the trouble is that the newspaper business, the reporters, the reporting, journalism, they believe that they are doing a good job. So you can't tell them that people are just stopped listening.
Thanks, Ken. Ken Gelati is one of the top photographers in Canada, by the way, so he knows what he's talking about. Look, I have faith in reporters and journalists. I've worked with them all my life. Most of my friends have worked in that field. I think it's our duty to recommend ways to make the situation better. I agree with you that, like, there's been a credibility loss in journalism. The public has lost a lot of credibility in journalism. I agree with that.
You know what, it's not exactly that. It's that when they don't, when they're hearing all of the noise of the news and all the noise that accompanies that with reaction, like the one party to another to get their reaction, they simply block that out and fall back to a belief system. No, they fall back to a belief system that depends on truths that are very old, and what we've been finding out through, especially through our own.
Ken, you have to, like, because this is being live streamed, you have to talk into the mic. But okay, I think I know what you're getting at. Okay.
But when they fall back to their own belief system, whatever it is. When they fall back to their own belief system, when they just don't disbelieve, but simply don't hear the news. And then we find out through a lot of the Aboriginal history that most Canadians were never aware of,
they're finding out that those things that they believed in were fictions. And when you start to examine a lot of what's written about in journalism right now, it is the belief in fictions that becomes an issue, and it keeps getting mentioned, the fictions that have been perpetrated for the last 70 years.
Yeah, look, I have a whole chapter in my book called Cold War Lies. How many people in this room, for instance, are aware that Manitoba, there was a federal and government, provincial government plan to use Manitoba in the 1950s to test nuclear bombs? Can I get a show of hands? Does that surprise people here? It's a fact. Manitoba, a site near Churchill, was going to be the test ground to test a British nuclear bomb called the Blue Danube, which was many times more powerful than the ones that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Governments never told us about that at the time. And if somebody stumbled across some bit of information, they would lie about it to cover it up. This happened through the entirety of in 1953, government secretly sprayed cadmium sulfide over the skies of Winnipeg. So, you know, I don't want to sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, but these are facts. And I agree with you when you talk about fictions. We've been lied to a lot by a whole bunch of people. And I've been a lifelong journalist, and I feel it's the job of me and my colleagues to expose as many of those lies as possible. Because of all the pressures I outlined, a lot of journalism doesn't do that these days, and I lament that, and I hope it's going to change.
Okay, thanks. I actually saw two hands over here, and I think that's about what we have time for.
Thanks, Cecil. This is great. The one question I have for you is kind of related to the whole comments that were said earlier about AI, specifically with generative AI. Recent interview with Noam Chomsky kind of lamented at the divestment of journalism and the dependency on information content. And in the world where more and more people are consuming information, not necessarily knowledge, but information, with the ever-present presence of generative AI tools, this is creating a bit of an issue. Is there something that you can maybe comment on that?
You know, I think with any new technology, there's promise of great things and of huge dangers. And I think that's the case with AI. I have seen some outstanding investigative journalism projects use AI to get to the truth of the situation. And so I see a lot of promise in that kind of thing. At the same time, AI is going to be used to trick us and dupe us even more. So it's a tool. It's a tool like anything is. And we can approach it with integrity and honesty, and some forces will approach it with duplicity. I think that's just the way it is, and that's the way it is with every new technology. But this one is a super scary one. And so I don't know. I'm not that much of an expert in it, although I see great promise in journalists actually using it to good effect. But again, you know, one of the questions that was asked came from Jacques Marcoux, who worked as a data journalist for CBC for a number of years, and these are the kinds of disciplines we have to encourage and grow in journalism. People who have skills in computational journalism, in geolocation, in analysis of photography and video, so that we don't have to take other people's words for who bombed that hospital. We can figure it out ourselves, independently and free from anybody's influence peddling. And I think AI is going to help with that, actually.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
Seems to have been a compelling case for the honesty and integrity of journalists. What it strikes me is that individual journalists are individuals, and they work for news organizations by and large. And really, they have to deal with the official narrative. And the case in point is the two wars that are going on now. The kind of reporting that is being done by the official media, the Globe and Mail or the Free Press or AP, wherever it comes from, or the CBC, in fact, they're keeping to an official narrative. And the official narrative is this: these are good guys, these are bad guys, this is what's happening. And if you are aware of what else is out there by actually searching out yourself, and there are other sources, but difficulty in understanding exactly how honesty and integrity of individual journalists can actually overcome that kind of situation.
You know, the last book I wrote was called A History of Investigative Journalism in Canada, in which I looked for all the different individuals who had done great pieces of work. A lot of them bucked the trend. A lot of them swam against the tide. A lot of them risked getting fired by their own news organizations to print a story. So I agree with the very first part of what you said. I agree with a lot of it, but with the very first part of what you said is there's individuals. Some individuals go play along with the game, whatever the game might be, to advance their career. Some political reporters are happy just to be fed a scoop by a politician on the understanding that if you do a good story for me, there'll be more coming along those lines. Others say, no, I won't do that. I'm not going to stoop to that. So I think you have to judge every individual as an individual, and you have to judge them by the quality of their work. And if you look through history, as I tried to do when I wrote that book, you'll see there are some. Seymour Hersh was the first person to document a mass atrocity committed by the US forces in Vietnam. He could not convince any mainstream US news organization to print his story in 1969, but he printed it independently. And only after he did that, all the different news organizations started picking it up, and it changed the whole trajectory of the war, I would say. So I believe individual journalists can do those things.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. Did you want to say anything else? Or we're ready for your signing.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate everyone that came. Thanks to McNally. I'm disappointed John wasn't here, but Nolan has done a sensational job, has she not? Thanks to Rob. Is Rob still here? Yeah, he's a busy guy. I worked with Rob for a number of years, and it was really nice of him. I didn't know he was coming, so it was really nice of him to show up. And thank you, Caroline, for that lovely introduction. Thanks.
Everybody, we're going to move on to the signing portion of the evening. As we mentioned before, we're going to just ask you to remain seated for a few moments while we transport Cecil over to the signing.
Is there a chariot?
Table? Yes, yeah. We'll get you your bodyguards, and you might get mobbed. You know, we have a very electrified crowd here tonight. And so, thanks again to Cecil. Thank you to Caroline. Thank you to Dundurn Press. And yeah, thanks to Premier Rob Canoe for just popping in, saying a few words. And thank you all for the engagement with the material and for showing up tonight in such large numbers. So thanks a lot.